Welcome to The Link Online. And hello from Canada. I'm Mark Montgomery along with my colleagues Vincenzo Morello.
Hey.
And Levon Savunce.
Hello here.
And in our control room today we have Léo Boulanger, Pierre-Luc Blais, and the man among men's, well, the guy who signs our paychecks anyway, Pierre Dutil. So we have to be nice to him. We're always nice to him. He's a nice guy.
He's a nice guy, and he's very nice to us.
Yeah. And he signs our pay stubs. So we always got to be nice to Pierre.
Your priorities.
He's shaking his finger. You know what? I want to say something. This is a unique year because we have something that happens in terms of dates that only happens once every 100 years. And that is, this week, for example, we had February 20th, 2020. So we had 2/20/2020. And so this happens like 12 times a year. We'll have, 20 of April and May and June and so on. So 2020. That only happens once every 100 years. And the last time it happened was September 19th, 1919. So we had 9/19/1919.
And on February 2nd, we had 0202.
Yeah, but you know what? I thought about it because we had a show that week, and I thought about it, and I missed it. So I'm here today to tell you your unique date, 2020, was this week. And
yes.
So, and that being said, we have an interesting show, and we'd like to welcome all our listeners. Bienvenue à nos auditeurs sur World Radio Paris. And herzlich willkommen with our listeners on the shortwave service in Germany, and listeners on Kauri 97.5 FM Radio Nigeria. Hello to you as well. And of course, we have all these good news and interesting stuff coming out of Canada on the show today. And we'll start with you, Levon. This is huge. This is the big news in Canada today.
The big news in Canada is railway blockades in solidarity with Indigenous protesters in British Columbia that basically crippled Canada's transportation network.
And still going on.
Still going on and actually expanding. So we'll see.
Vincenzo, on a completely different subject, you are talking about?
I'm talking about a developer out of Ontario who's making a video game that's only based on audio.
And I understand this is good for people who are sightless.
Yes, exactly.
Because they can play as well.
Yeah.
All right. And I'll be talking about something in office environments, the idea of the open office concept. Sorry. Take it easy. Yes, the open office concept. Good thing or not so good? Those are some of the subjects coming up today on The Link Online. All right, Levon, we're going to start out with this. This, of course, is absolutely huge news and has been for a couple of weeks now all across Canada. It's just politically, it's a huge thing. Economically, it's become an enormous problem. Tell us a bit about it.
So we mentioned this. This is a railway blockade in Ontario that has basically crippled Canada's transportation network, especially in Eastern Canada, and has already led to hundreds, close to 1,500 layoffs, and counting, fears of shortages of basic goods, propane. So, but to understand this story, we have to go back to the western coast of Canada, and it's all about a protest in support of this small indigenous group of hereditary chiefs. So this all started with the construction of a pipeline, a natural gas pipeline in northern British Columbia. It's called the Coastal Link
Coastal Gas Link.
Coastal Gas Link pipeline. It's a 670-kilometer pipeline that runs from northeastern British Columbia towards the Pacific coast, and which will it's a key part of this $40 billion LNG Canada export pipeline that will eventually export natural gas, LNG, liquefied natural gas, to markets outside of Canada. Now, this pipeline has the support of the absolute majority of First Nations through which territory it passes. But it has run into a very important and critical snag in Wet'suwet'en territory. And here's important to know that in Canada, you have almost two systems, parallel systems of indigenous government. So you have the hereditary chiefs, people who derive their authority through traditional law. And you also have the elected chiefs. So this is the system that has been imposed on these First Nations and has been now part of First Nation communities since almost the time of Confederation, since 1874.
Since the Indian Act, I want to say.
Since the Indian Act. So these two parallel systems work. So in Wet'suwet'en, the elected chiefs and also the majority of the hereditary chiefs support the pipeline because they see this as an opportunity to bring jobs, economic development through this very remote part of British Columbia. But there is a small group of hereditary chiefs who are really opposed to this pipeline for various reasons, environmental reasons, traditional reasons, and of course the main reason being that they consider that Canada and British Columbia don't have the legal right to build this pipeline through their traditional territory because unlike other parts of Canada, in British Columbia, a lot of First Nations never actually surrendered title to their territory to the federal and provincial crowns. So their argument is that Canadian laws basically don't work on their territory and Canada doesn't have the right to build this pipeline through their territory. And this is a fight that has been going on since at least 2010. They have built cabins and camps on this key logging road. This is a very remote area to block access to construction crews.
Sites, yeah.
And the company that builds this pipeline has obtained court injunction. So basically, court orders ordering them to leave and allow construction crews to access the area to begin construction of this pipeline. Eventually, after 2 years of this conflict, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, this is Canada's National Federal Police, moved in at the beginning of February and started arresting people in this series of camps that the hereditary chiefs had erected and their supporters. The hereditary chiefs called for support nationally, and their call has been answered all across Canada. You saw demonstrations, protests in support of these Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs and their position. And one of the key protests has been in the Mohawk territory of Tyendinaga, which is not far from the city of Belleville. It's about 250 kilometers west of Ottawa, if you know your Canadian geography. And so the Mohawks, and this is the other side of the country, 4,500 kilometers from British Columbia, have set up a series of blockades. They're not actually... it's not very clear that they're actually blocking the railway. They're right next to it.
But see, they're not actually blocking the railway, as you say, but there are other blockades that are actually blocking railways elsewhere in the country, including one here in Saint-Lambert.
So this has been going on for more than 2 years, and this blockade has caused quite a lot of worry in Canada. The business community is very worried. I mean, people whose jobs, people who work for the railway are very worried. This is affecting freight traffic and passenger traffic. So this week, some passenger service has started getting back, but it's not back completely. But the freight traffic is stopped. So this means there's shortage of things like propane gas, other basic commodities. Shippers have to reroute their shipments using highways and trucks. So the federal government has been under increasing pressure to intervene. And Prime Minister Trudeau finally addressed, he actually had to cut his foreign trip short. He didn't go to Barbados to rally support for Canada's UN security seat bid, and so had to come back and stay in Canada to deal with this issue. So on Tuesday, he rose in the House of Commons to basically tell Canadians that he shares their frustration with this blockade, but he also asked for people's patience.
Time, past time, for this situation to be resolved. But what we are facing was not created overnight. It was not created because we have embarked upon a path of reconciliation recently in our history. It is because for too long in our history, for too many years, we failed to do so. So finding a solution will not be simple. It will take determination, hard work, and cooperation. There is no relationship more important to Canada than the one with Indigenous peoples. And today, as Prime Minister, I am once again formally extending my hand in partnership and trust. Over the last 11 days, our government has been working on a path forward, even as many have been saying we should give up. Because we know what is at stake. We know that we cannot afford to fail. So we are creating a space for peaceful, honest dialogue with willing partners. As we heard this morning from Mohawk leaders and from National Chief Perry Bellegarde, we need to resolve this through dialogue and mutual respect. To the Wet'suwet'en and Mohawk nations, and Indigenous leaders across the country, we are listening. We are not asking that you stop standing up for your communities, your rights, and for what you believe. We only ask that you be willing to work with the federal government as a partner in finding solutions. You remind us, rightly so, that too often trust has been betrayed in the history of Indigenous negotiations with Canadian governments. In fact, that underlines the difficulty of solving this situation today. But our common ground is the desire to arrive at solutions. We cannot resolve this alone. Just like we need Indigenous leaders to be partners, we also need Canadians to show both resolve and collaboration. Everyone has a stake in getting this right.
So that was Prime Minister Justin Trudeau addressing the House of Commons on Tuesday. Right after he spoke, the outgoing leader of the official opposition, Conservative leader Andrew Scheer, got up, and he had this assessment of Trudeau's speech and position.
Mr. Speaker, that was the weakest response to a national crisis in Canadian I listened to the Prime Minister's word salad just now, Mr. Speaker, and at least two key things were missing. A clear denunciation that the actions of these radical activists are illegal, and some kind of an action plan that would put an end to the illegal blockades and get our economy back on track. The Prime Minister's statement was a complete abdication of responsibility and of leadership.
And so that was Conservative leader Andrew Scheer speaking in the House of Commons. There was this very rowdy debate. I mean, the Speaker had to intervene a couple of times to keep things calm. As you can see, the Liberal position is that they're going to try to find a negotiated solution to this crisis. The Mohawk protesters are saying that they will not leave the blockade, their protests, until the Royal Canadian Mounted Police leaves Wet'suwet'en traditional territory. Now, later that week, we found out that the RCMP might be willing to pull some of the officers from the territory. So it's not clear whether this gesture would be enough to kind of get things going. In the meantime, there are some more protests springing up. One actually not far from us here on the in the southern suburb of Montreal, in Saint-Lambert, some protesters who are not indigenous from what it looks like, in blocking a railway,
they set up a little
commuter
camp.
line that brings suburban passengers from southern suburbs of Montreal into the city. And there's another court injunction to get them out, but it's not working. Police are still waiting. As of this morning, the protesters are still there. I have to say, it was minus 20 something at night. It takes a lot of determination
or a lot of blankets,
and a lot of blankets, and to keep you warm. So we'll see how this goes. It's definitely a situation that is not easy to resolve, and of course the big worry for everyone is that this ends in violence, and this ends in something like the Oka crisis 30 years ago, when the Quebec government actually had to ask the federal government to bring in the Canadian military to deal with this what some people at the time described as an armed uprising or a standoff between Mohawk warriors in Ganastake and Ganawake near Montreal. One police officer was killed. 5 years later, an indigenous protester was shot by a police sniper, Dudley George, in another confrontation in Ontario near Lake Huron. So there's a lot of bad blood and fears that this could degenerate into some kind of bloodshed and basically undermine the last 5 years of liberal policy of reconciliation with Indigenous Canadians.
Which seems not to have worked very much at all, because we have this conflict. Which again, if we go back to the original, what you were saying off the top, it seems to have been or is a power struggle internally within the Wet'suwet'en, because you have the elected chiefs and you have the hereditary chiefs. And the elected chiefs say, we want this, we agree with it, we get lots of money for it and lots of jobs, which we need for our community. And they have said publicly that 85% of the Wet'suwet'en band is in favor of this. So you have this whole enormous conflict is, as you say, it's a result of a small group within that band.
Well, but you also have to understand that, as Prime Minister Trudeau mentioned, I mean, this is something that goes much deeper than just an internal conflict within one band. It kind of displays the colonial heritage or the heritage of the colonization of these people. I mean, these conflicts are nothing new, and whether the Liberal government finds a way of getting through this without conflict is probably going to set the tone for federal Indigenous relations for years to come. And I mean, we have another hugely controversial pipeline that is going through British Columbia. Trans Mountain, which runs into a lot more opposition among, here, at least in this case, most of the First Nations actually support the natural gas pipeline. In the case of Trans Mountain, the entire province of British Columbia is opposed to it. So it's going to be interesting to see how the government deals with this issue and how this kind of sets a blueprint for the future of the Trans Mountain pipeline.
But now again, the government is in a very difficult position in this, because if they start to negotiate with the traditional hereditary chiefs, that gives them the power, and that kind of undermines the entire way they've been dealing with Indigenous people for decades under the Indian Act, where they have the elected band councils, because now that possibly could create a whole bunch of conflict elsewhere in the country with people saying, again, who do we listen to? Do we listen to the elected band or the traditional band?
And to be kind of bring the other side is the other side said, listen, you have an unelected queen as head of state, and why is having a hereditary monarchy in Canada okay, but not having some kind of a hereditary system in
because the
indigenous
Queen is
that is kind of much older than the British monarchy in some sense.
You've brought this up before in the past, and again, the royal family has very little actual power, right? So, I mean, they can't overturn any political decision. So,
but it just tells you just how complicated this whole issue is and how important it is to get it right.
All right, we're going to move on because Vince is here going to talk to us in just a moment about a new video game. All right, before we get to that, who should we say hello to, Levon?
Oh, yeah, we have a lot of people listening and watching us. Hemant Kumar from India says, a very good program, thank you. Krzysztof Sajewicz from Poland, good morning from Poland. We have Rek Natarajan watching us from Colombia. We have Gustavo Lucas watching us from Uruguay, and he says, un cordiale saluto a Vincenzo. So,
Buongiorno.
Buongiorno. So Gustavo probably speaks several languages because I've seen him make comments in English, French, and Italian.
He's a regular, Gustavo.
Yes,
we like him.
He's
Gustavo.
probably one of our most loyal listeners and Facebook viewers.
Okay. Well, Vincenzo, what's the story about this new video game? Just give us a sense of what's going on here.
So basically, so obviously, like graphics and video games have always been really connected. People really care about how a game looks. But one studio in Ontario called Falling Squirrel Games is making a game where the players are only guided by controller and audio feedback. So the game is called The Veil. It's a medieval role-playing game. And so what's novel about this game is it's not only accessible to people with sight, it's also accessible to people who are visually impaired. And what's really, I get not funny about it, but when I spoke to the creative director, Dave Evans, he told me that how he came up with the idea for a game, he wasn't even thinking about the accessibility part of it.
Basically, about 4 years ago, I sort of wanted to start a side project that would utilize some things that I could do very easily, that would sort of show off the things that I'm relatively good at compared to other things. For example, I'm not an artist. I don't do any 3D modeling or anything. And I started in the industry as a cinema director, motion capture director, and a voiceover director. So I thought, hey, I could make an audio-based game where I wouldn't have to worry about the art side of things. And I could work with great actors, get great performances from them, and I'm also a writer, so I could play with all sorts of interesting elements of narrative very cheaply. So if I wanted to have the world, let's say, shift to a desert location or to a mountaintop, the expense of obviously modeling and a whole environment based on a mountain would be expensive, but instead I could use a sound package to sort of create that area. And then I was very freed up to basically take my narrative wherever I wanted to go. But very quickly, as I started developing this game, I realized, of course, there's a group of people out there that would be very interested in something like this. So people who are low vision or visually impaired, there's games out there similar to this, but it's one of their few ways of being able to play games is by playing an audio-based game. So that's I sort of walked backwards into this advocacy aspect of the game, because it's something that I can do and do fairly well, I guess.
So yeah, Evans was telling me that players can get a chance to play the game, hopefully this spring, on people's personal computers, but he wasn't sure of an exact release date yet. And I encourage everyone to read the full article on rcinet.ca.
Yeah, and you can see there's a trailer of what you can expect there as well. All right, coming up in just a moment, the open office concept. All right, in offices around the world, of course, a long time ago, the idea was to create these little cubes, and everybody would have their individual little cube, and that became known as a somewhat derogatory term, a cube farm. And then that wasn't appreciated too much, so somebody came up with the big new idea, open office concept. And nomad desks, whereby anybody can sit at any desk. So you can come into work and say, oh, there's a desk over there, I'll go work over there. This was supposed to be a big new deal and help communications because people would be sitting beside each other and everything else and could overhear everybody else's conversations and so on. Turns out, not such a good idea after all. And I spoke to Kane Wilmot. He is the CEO and founder of IQ Offices, and that's a co-working space. And he recently commissioned a study to ask people what they thought of this. And here's what they had to say.
What we found on this survey was that 57% of those surveyed said that they were distracted at work. And then what we did is we took that survey and we broke it down by age, and we found that under 35, it rose to 68% of those surveyed said that they were distracted at work. What's interesting is that 73% said that if they weren't distracted at work, they get an extra 2 hours of productive time every single day. So that's 10 hours a week. Imagine what you could do in 10 hours a week.
So how does office design, and perhaps even explain a little bit about this open office concept, affect employee focus and even health?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when we did the survey, what we really wanted to figure out was what are the top things. So what is it that you're finding distracting at work? And what is it that you're finding distracting within your workspace? So what we found is there were three top items. The first one was loud talkers. And so loud talkers in the space, very distracting. The second one was this open concept design that you and I talked about earlier. So this open concept design with loud rec areas becomes very distracting. And then the third was nomad work style, meaning that you don't have a dedicated desk. You don't have dedicated workspace. When you come to the office every single day, you sit where there's availability.
Is this not a counter to human kind of aspect where you want to belong to somewhere? You come in and you have your little desk. You put up pictures of your family or your friends or your dog or something, and you have your stapler and scissors and so on. But if you go into a place like you're talking about where there's nothing dedicated to you, you don't have that loyalty or connection to the workplace.
Yeah, I agree 100%. And the other thing, too, is, as humans, we're creatures of habit. We like to understand and have some predictability on what our workspace is going to look like every single day. That's not an effective way to work, where every single day you have no idea whether you're going to have a desk, never mind what desk you're going to work in. So if you're going into a workspace where you don't have any predictability of what that workspace is going to be like, first of all, you may be sitting in a space that's not optimized for productivity, number one. But number two, you have to acclimate to that space. So that's going to take time, and that's going to take away from productive time as well.
Now, this idea of open office space, that was all the big new idea of a few years ago. But there have been many surveys that say this isn't a good idea. So why are we still doing it?
Well, I think we're starting to see a trend of companies really focusing on, we did open concept because there was those cubicles, right? And then what happened was, very boring office space. And so technology companies and companies started to say, well, what does it take to attract people to our space? And they started to focus on that employee experience. And with that, I think what happened is the pendulum just swung a little too far in the opposite direction, where they said, well, if we put in cool ping pong tables and music and we have video games and we have these sort of things, this is what's going to attract people. But what they're finding now with these studies is that these things, although they may seem attractive on the way in, the reality is it's very difficult to work in those sort of environments. So companies are starting to look at, well, what does it take now to actually create a productive workspace?
Well, Mr. Wilmot, let me ask you this then. How do you create this balance between an open concept, which is enabling of communications and so on, but not so open that it's distracting, and yet not so isolating that it keeps you apart from your workers?
Yeah, I think the real key on that is multiple work environments. So just even something as simple as a sit-stand desk. You can actually have variety within your workspace that is your workspace every single day. But in addition to that, creating other spaces where you can go and you can have a collaborative meeting, but it can be private. And you can also have an open space where you can mix and mingle and social and network. But then you also have spaces where it is quiet, like we have quiet rooms. But that's the real key is instead of having one environment and not giving people choice, because as you start to hit some of those lulls, you can go to these other spaces and you can rejuvenate.
And that was my conversation with Kane Wilmot, who is the CEO of IQ Workspaces, co-working space, and of course, open office and nomad desk. And guess where we are going when we move to the new building? Exactly. Well, that's all the time we have for today. So for Vincenzo Morello, Lavonce Wunz, myself, Mark Montgomery, Leo Boulanger, Pierre-Luc Blais, and of course the man amongst men, Pierre Dutil, who signs our paychecks. Hi, Pierre. Take care until next week. Bye-bye from all of us.
Bye.